and welcome to Top Story, which we bring you today from the Russian capital, Moscow, where the preliminary results of Sunday's presidential election are already known. No prizes for guessing the outcome. Kremlin-backed candidate Dmitry Medvedev has won a predictably decisive victory. But this election has always closer resembled a coronation than a popular ballot. So what difference will it make, if any at all, that Russia will have a new president? Will he stamp his own personality on the job? Indeed, who is Dmitry Medvedev? Well, joining me now to look ahead to a Russia under President Medvedev is Andrei Kortunov, who's president of the new Eurasia Foundation. Andrei, thanks very much for being on Top Story. What are we to make of this election? Does it bring forward the process of democracy in Russia in any way?
Well, we can only hope that it will accelerate democratic transition in Russia. Indeed, the selection of Medvedev is in itself an important decision by President Putin, because he had some other alternatives as well. And as far as Medvedev is concerned, he is definitely younger, he's definitely better educated, and hopefully he's more liberal than his predecessor.
Well, you say hopefully, and that's part of the problem, isn't it? We don't really know who Dmitry Medvedev is, or do we? Perhaps you know more.
Well, of course, we know something. We have his track record, which is not that impressive. His file is rather thin, but still, I think that we can argue that he knows something about how to run the country. He has some experience, specifically in running social projects. And he made a couple of rather reassuring statements, saying that he would prefer to have more democracy, he would prefer to focus on human capital development. So he tried at least to sound liberal and pro-Western.
Tried, as you say, to sound. I suppose the big question that everybody's asking is Dmitry Medvedev going to be his own man, or is he simply going to be the puppet of the outgoing president, Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think that the situation is even more complex, because no one can ignore a very delicate balance of powers in the Kremlin and around the Kremlin. Definitely that there are various forces, and it's a very delicate constellation of personalities and institutions. So no matter who comes to power, and in our case it's Mr. Medvedev, of course, but no matter who sits in the Kremlin, he or she has to keep in mind all these various factors, all independent variables, and all internal constraints that are there. So Medvedev will be constrained not only by Mr. Putin, but also by this huge state machinery that was erected by Mr. Putin.
Is there any doubt at all that Mr. Putin is going to become prime minister?
Well, he might still change his mind, but it's not clear what he means by becoming prime minister, because I don't think that Mr. Putin is a man who would like to spend all his time on these small, nitty-gritty issues of running the government. He's not a person who likes to spend at office long hours, spare his weekends, and forget about his family. So I don't really know how he will run the prime minister office. I would rather think that he would prefer to take a more strategic view, and he would like probably to steer Mr. Medvedev rather than to assist him in the day-to-day business of running the government.
So that's encouraging in a way for Mr. Medvedev. It sounds, the way you put it, that he will have some room for maneuver.
Well, I hope so, though again, it's a delicate situation, because according to the Constitution, Prime Minister cannot steer President. It is exactly the other way around. It is President who should give orders to Prime Minister, and Prime Minister should assist President in specific areas. So it will mean a rather painful readjustment for both people, and I think that we will have a bumpy road ahead of us.
Do you see the possibility of two rival centers of power emerging in Russia? And if so, what could be the possible implications of that?
I think it's almost unavoidable, even if the two men have very cordial relationships, even if there are no problems between Medvedev and Putin as personalities. Their bureaucratic machines will fight each other. They will compete with each other. That's the logic of any bureaucracy. So it is an interesting situation to watch. And I think that it will take some time, maybe a year, maybe more than a year before the dust settles down and we see the outcomes.
What direction do you think President Medvedev is going to take Russia now, particularly as regards to the economy? He's spoken about the need for reform, for pushing forward the liberal agenda. He's spoken too about the need for the rule of law. Do you think those are areas that he's likely to press hard on?
Absolutely. And I think that the major difference between Putin and Medvedev is that Putin was able to put the country back on track, and Medvedev has to start moving the country. There are a number of issues that were not resolved under President Putin. For example, he didn't really manage to fight corruption in the country. He didn't really manage to fight this omnipotent bureaucratic machine. There is a lot of incompetence, there is a lot of waste, there is a lot of abuse of power. And to some extent, one can argue that Putin has exhausted his potential. He depleted his ability to change the country. And right now, there is a different set of challenges that Mr. Medvedev has to face, and he will need different means to stand up and to confront these challenges.
You said there that President Putin failed to meet the challenge of corruption. Is it possible, do you think, for President Medvedev to rise and meet that challenge, given the vested interest that would be involved?
Well, it's a big question, of course, but in the end of the day, the only way to move the country ahead is to address this unfinished business of Mr. Putin. The only way we can maintain a relatively high level of economic growth, we can maintain this direction of economic development, is by changing the structure of the Russian economy. So, in a sense, Mr. Medvedev does not have too many options. He should either turn into a pale shadow of Mr. Putin and to see his popularity going down once all this unfinished business is after him, or he has to mobilize himself, he has to mobilize people around him and to act very boldly and very decisively. It's a matter of personal will, it's a matter of guts, it's a matter of conviction, and this is something that Mr. Medvedev will have to demonstrate.
But that really would mean a very serious power struggle within the elites of Russian society.
Absolutely, and I would say even more, that it would mean that Mr. Medvedev will have to dismantle at least a part of his predecessor's heritage. That's not easy, that might be painful, and that will be met with a lot of resistance.
And that, I'm afraid, is where we have to end it. Thanks very much to Andrei Kartunov. And remember, you can watch the rest of our coverage of Russia's presidential election today on France24. And join us tomorrow on Top Story for another edition. Goodbye for now.